all going to see. Okay. Good evening, and thank you for coming here this evening to the forum for a very special event where we have not one but two former deans who will be speaking to us, both of whom, along with the third participant, have all exercised leadership in their lives in distinguished ways and are also distinguished by their scholarship. Tonight is a chance for all of us here at the Kennedy School and at Harvard, more generally speaking, to hear from Joe Nye about his new book. It is called The Powers to Lead. All of you know that Joe Nye has won an international reputation for his work and analysis in the field of international affairs. He not only served at various posts here at the Kennedy School, teaching, written a number of books about international affairs. He really, and you can't go anywhere today without a discussion of soft power, a term he coined and really brought into the conversation in contrast to the uses of hard power. And almost anywhere you pick up, almost any leadership book that you pick up today or any analysis of international affairs refers back to Joe Nye. Some of you here in the audience tonight, young global leaders, and we just celebrated Klaus Schwab's 70th birthday in Geneva and had a big conversation with him there about leadership. Immediately, Joe Nye's analysis was front and center in the conversation. And after serving as dean of this school, after serving in government, in various leadership positions, and then very importantly for some of us here, being really a guiding force, a driving force behind the creation of the Center for Public Leadership, he himself gained a strong intellectual interest in the subject of leadership. And so after stepping down as dean, he decided to take some time and really read the literature, think about it, and to write something about, a book about leadership in the 21st century. What does it mean to lead in this new age of information revolution, of distrust of leaders, of sort of internationalization of so many issues and problems? And so he has made a contribution now to the literature and is here. We're going to open tonight with a statement by him of about 15 minutes in length to help us explore some of the issues that he has raised here. I very much commend this book to you. It's called The Powers to Lead by Joseph S. Nye. I will tell you, among the many other books that Joe Nye has written, one of the more recent was a novel on the power game, a Washington novel. And it was a mutual friend of ours, John Deutsch, who said he would give $1,000 to this school if he could come into this forum and read the sex scenes from that novel. There are no sex scenes in this work, but it's more powerful than that. It's more compelling than that, and we're delighted to have Joe here. Before Joe steps to the podium, I would like to introduce the other two people who are going to be essentially respondents and then discussants. To Joe's immediate left is Graham Allison, as you know, many of you know, a man who served, as Joe did, as distinguished dean of this school. And it's very much in what was 77 to 89, Graham, was that about the period when you were there, 77 to 89? Who is, both of them are PhDs from Harvard and political science. Graham's book on decision making coming out of the Cuban Missile Crisis remains a classic in the field. But now all over the world, if anybody wants to talk about the problems facing the world, you find people immediately talking about nuclear proliferation and the questions associated with that. And the person's name who comes up in that conversation again and again is Graham Allison. And indeed, I think in one of the Democratic debates, I think Hillary started citing you, didn't you, for your propositions on one thing and another? I think it was just before New Hampshire. It helped her to win New Hampshire. I'm sure if she'd done it before South Carolina, it would have gone the other way. But Graham is going to be one of our discussants, and the other is going to be Barbara Kellerman, who was the founding executive director of our Center for Public Leadership. But very importantly, you should know she has written a dozen books or more. I think 18 now, Barbara. How many is it up to? Yeah, right. Well, she's competing with Warren Bennis for the number of good books written about this subject. Recently wrote a book about bad leadership, and now has written a book about followership. It's very popular here on this faculty as well. And she's the great James McGregor Burns lecturer here at the school. You're going to hear James McGregor Burns' name perhaps more than once tonight, because in writing an endorsement for Joe's book, I said, you know, James McGregor Burns was the path-breaking figure in leadership studies. He wrote a book back in 1978 that to this day is regarded as sort of one of the classics in the field. And after reading Joe's book, I said, this is the most important restatement and redefinition of what leadership is about since the publication of James McGregor Burns' book on leadership 30 years ago. So Joe, we welcome you here to the forum. Thank you.
Thank you, David. It's fun to be here to chat about leadership. What I want to do is tell you that I think we as a country in the United States don't think very clearly about leadership or about power, for that matter. We're much given to strong, macho, hard power images of both power and leadership. And I think until we get over that, we're not going to be able to have a sensible foreign policy or indeed a very good process of choosing our presidential leaders. I was talking to a congresswoman, a friend of mine, at one point, and she said, you know, your idea of soft power really makes a lot of sense, but it's a real loser politically. I can't stand up on the stump and talk about soft power. And that's an interesting puzzle about discourse in the United States. If power is the ability to get what you want, and if you can do it by threatening people with sticks or paying them with carrots or by attracting them, which is soft power, the idea that we can't talk about soft power, or indeed have not been very good at using it, there's something wrong with that. And one of the things that I've tried to do in previous books is to get people to think more in more sophisticated terms about power internationally. But in this new book, what I'm trying to do is get them to also realize that you have to think more clearly about power and leadership inside the country at the individual level and at the group level. One thing you have to do if you're going to understand power or leadership is to start with context. If you don't make a specification about the context, you're going to get something wrong. So for example, some of you heard me use this before. If you looked at Winston Churchill in January of 1940, was this one of the great leaders of the 20th century? Clearly not. He was a failed, washed-up backbench MP. By June, he was the man of the hour. And what changed? Not one of Winston Churchill's traits. What changed was the context. Hitler invaded France, drove British troops into the sea at Dunkirk, and suddenly Churchill was the man of the hour and the great leader. So unless you understand the context, you're not going to understand power or leadership. And yet we're not good at this in the United States. If you look at the way we talk about leadership, we talk about it in what I call the big man stereotype. Now you might say, yes, but big men do prevail. I don't know how many of you realize that the average CEO of an American corporation is taller than other men, or that it's been measured that an extra inch of height in a male is worth about $800 of annual salary. But be careful about the causal relationship there. Just like the presence of fire engines doesn't create fires, the fact that large men are often CEOs may be that we think these are the people who should be CEOs, doesn't mean they're very good at it. But in any case, the big man theory is one which is very much on our minds. There's also a tendency of some leadership theorists to reinforce this by sociobiology. They say, look, we are essentially chimpanzees in terms of our genome, almost 99% the same. And when you study groups of chimpanzees, there's always an alpha male. And if it's not one alpha male, it's another replacing that alpha male. And what would you expect but that we should have a big man theory of leadership? The trouble with that, of course, is that there's no leadership gene, and that when people do studies about fraternal and identical twins to see how you account for leadership, turns out genetics can account maybe for a third, but 2/3 is unaccounted for. Or a better test of this might be to look at bonobos, which was a smaller version of chimpanzee in the eastern Congo, where the interesting thing is there are no alpha males, there are female rulers. Now, half of you may shake your head this way and half this way as you hear that, but the important point is that the sociobiological explanations are badly wrong. And the more we think about this big man theory of leadership, the more we're likely to misunderstand what's going on in today's world. In today's post-industrial or information-based society, what you have is flatter hierarchies, more networks, and you also have knowledge workers who are less deferential. The net effect of that is that you are not the king of the mountain as a leader, commanding and controlling. You're the center of the circle, attracting. And it's sometimes argued that that means that soft power is going to become more important if you have to attract in the center of a circle rather than give orders as the king of the mountain. And some people indeed are going so far in a new conventional wisdom as to try to replace the big man theory with the big woman theory. The argument here is that in stereotypical terms, women intuit soft power better than men, and therefore their leadership is likely to prevail in this new society. There's something in that. In fact, there's some studies that have been done that show not only is soft power becoming more important, but women are better at it. But I would argue that we should avoid the dangers of stereotypical thinking, whether it's positive or negative, because they stop us from thinking more clearly about what we do need. What we do need is to ask, what are the skills that a male or a female leader needs, both in soft power and hard power, and how can they combine them in different contexts? Or a simpler way of putting that is that a lot of men are going to have to learn to act more like women, and a lot of women are going to have to act more like men. The question is, do they develop the contextual intelligence to know when to be which? And that's independent of gender. Basically, there are 6 critical skills, 3 of them soft power skills, 2 hard power skills, and 1 finally, which is contextual intelligence of putting it together. And to summarize this very quickly, the most important of the soft power skills that you need, whether you're a man or a woman, is emotional IQ. Now, you all know what IQ is, which is the ability to do well in the French school system of the 1890s, you know, math and spatial relations and so forth. But what psychologists have found is that IQ accounts for about 20% of success in life, and that 80% is unaccounted for. Of the 80% unaccounted for, a good chunk of it, though we're not sure exactly how much, is emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence is the mastery of oneself and the ability to use one's emotions to reach out and attract others. A good way of putting this would be to use the anecdote of when Oliver Wendell Holmes met Franklin Roosevelt, when Roosevelt was president in the 1930s. Holmes, of course, was the grand jurist who had been in the Civil War. And when the old man was asked, "What did you think of President Roosevelt?" he said, "Second-class intellect, but first-class temperament," which is another way of saying good emotional IQ. Now, contrast Roosevelt with Richard Nixon, who probably would have outscored Roosevelt on a straight IQ test. But Nixon did not have emotional intelligence. He had inner demons and an enemies list. And that contrast of Roosevelt and Nixon gives you a way to think of emotional intelligence. Vision is the second soft power skill by which you attract people. And on vision, you're talking about a picture of the future that gives meaning and inspires others. But a good vision has to balance realism with inspiration. Otherwise, it's not grand, it's grandiose. And perhaps the best contrast here would be the 2 Bush presidencies. You won't find 2 presidents more genetically similar, but you won't find 2 presidents who've had a greater extreme of success and failure in foreign policy. If you look at Bush Sr., Bush 41, he famously said, "I don't do the vision thing." And that probably hurt him when it came time to be re-elected by the American public. But Bush 43, who placed a great deal of emphasis on his vision of invading the Middle East, replacing Saddam Hussein with a democracy of Iraq, and thereby bringing about a change in the roots of terrorism, that vision turned out to be grandiose. It was beyond our capacities. And in that sense, it's interesting that two presidents so similar genetically chose such different visions with such different results. The third soft power skill is communication. If you have emotional intelligence and a vision, you have to get it across. And we usually think of communication in terms of rhetoric. We've just celebrated the death of Martin Luther King, which reminds us that anybody who has listened to a picture or a tape of Martin Luther King speaking knows how brilliant he was at using the cadences of the African American church and tradition to reach out beyond one community to the whole nation. A true genius at communication. But communication is nonverbal as well as verbal. Indeed, there's an argument psychologists make that probably more than half of our communication is nonverbal. And in that, the master probably would be Mahatma Gandhi. Anybody of you who've looked at a picture of Gandhi as a young man dressed up as a British lawyer with his neat suit and necktie and looking just like the proper British gentleman, and contrast that with Gandhi, the leader of a nationalist movement, dressed in loose peasant clothing, knows how he understood the symbolism of nonverbal communication, or his great salt march to the sea in 1930, in which he went carefully, step by step, letting the tension grow and build before he violated the law by making salt. Brilliant use of nonverbal communication. So emotional IQ, vision, communications, but then you have to combine those with two key hard power skills. One is organization, and that's the ability to manage the flows and reward systems of a group. Otherwise, you wind up like Hans Christian Andersen's Emperor and his famous clothing, where all the courtiers told him how wonderful his clothes were, but it took a little boy to say, "Sorry, sir, you're naked." And it's all too frequent that leaders wind up in situations where they don't learn what their clothing really is looking like. And if you look at organization, you realize that we have tended to think of a distinction or disjunction between leaders and managers. At the business school now, there's this great tendency to say you're either a leader or a manager. We should pay more attention to leaders as managers, leaders who know how to surround themselves with people and get the information they need to make sure that things are happening as they think. And there again, if you look at the two Bush presidencies, you'll see that Bush 41 was a very adept manager and had Brett Scowcroft organize the people who were managing his foreign policy, and included many of the same people, strong-minded people, who were important in Bush 43's administration, people like Cheney and Colin Powell and so forth. 43 did not have that management skill. Ironically, though he had an MBA, he didn't have that same managerial skill that his father had. But this is not just a question of the Bushes. If you look at people who've been extremely important or able in this area, Dwight Eisenhower, who people thought was a do-nothing president, until later historians found as they looked behind the scenes, he gave this sense of ease and relaxation on the surface, but the books that were written about him were titled The Hidden Hand Presidency. Behind the scenes, he knew how information was flowing, what was happening. So organizational skills are crucial. And the second hard power skill that's important is what I call Machiavellian political skills, the ability to size up other people's weaknesses and strengths, their likes and dislikes, to put together minimum winning coalitions to get things done. And sometimes people say, well, that's the politics of fear and bullying. But there are times when, in fact, it works. But notice the question about bullies. Sheer bullying doesn't work, but bullying with a vision sometimes does. Rod Kramer, who's been here this week teaching the young global leaders, has developed the phrase great intimidators. And a great intimidator is a bully with a vision. And perhaps the best way to illustrate this would be with Hyman Rickover, who is sometimes called the father of the American nuclear navy. Now you might say, Admiral Rickover, this grand swashbuckling admiral. No, Admiral Rickover was a little fellow near the bottom of his class at Annapolis, but with two great skills. One was the ability to recruit resources for the Congress, from the Congress, and the other was the ability to set absolute standards that there'll be no accidents, perfect safety standards, and by bullying people into adhering to those standards, he got young naval officers, the best known naval officers, to want to work for him. So if you're going to use Machiavellian political skills, knowing how to combine them with a vision is also crucial. But finally, let me touch the question of contextual intelligence, which is knowing when and how to put these skills together. And there, the interesting point is that the diagnostic skill of aligning tactics with strategy is what makes smart power. And it's a lot like surfing. If you get up on your surfboard before the wave is in, you're going to fall off. If you wait too long, you're not going to make the wave. Bismarck, in the 19th century, put it much more poetically, in which he said, the leader has to hear God's footsteps in history and seize his garment as he sweeps by. Perhaps between surfing and Bismarck, there's something in between, which might be summarized more adequately by Mark Twain, in which he said, the interesting thing about his cat was that if it sat on a hot stove, it would never sit on a hot stove again, but it wouldn't sit on a cold stove either. That ability to understand what's a hot stove, what's a cold stove, what's an abnormal crisis, what's an ordinary crisis, how do you adjust your skills to the situation is what goes to the heart of contextual intelligence. Jeff Immelt, the CEO of GE, once put it this way. He said, there are about a dozen times a year when I have to tell people in GE, we've had a discussion, I've heard you, but we're doing it my way. He said, if I did this 18 times a year, I'd lose my best people. If I did it 3 times a year, the company would fall apart. That's contextual intelligence. And that's independent of gender. That's a skill that you develop to be able to use hard and soft power and combine them in smart power. Now, can it be taught? Can it be learned? The American Army argues that the trilogy for this is what they call be, know, do. Be means to understand yourself, whether it comes from introspection or from 360-degree feedback from your friends and neighbors. Know means to look back at history, to see what other leaders have done, when they've succeeded, when they've failed, to look at case studies of those who've done things well and done things badly. And do means to go out and do it, to have the experience, but add to it something the Army always does, which is what they call an after-action review. It's not enough just to have the experience, but to ask if I did it well, what could I have done to make it better? If I didn't do it as well as I should, what did I do wrong? That combination means that we can indeed learn. And in this year, as we're picking presidents, with an interesting year in the sense we have 3 senators without any executive experience to pick among, 3 interesting and different types of leaders, trying to judge the question of how well they combine hard and soft power skills, and how good is their contextual intelligence, knowing when to use them, under what circumstances, is going to be one of the most intriguing and one of the hardest things for us to do. But if we're going to understand the rest of the world, if we're going to do a better job of using American power for positive purposes, to be an exporter of hope rather than fear, to get to a situation where we once again can rely on our soft power mixed with our hard power, then we're going to have to pick a leader who has contextual intelligence and understands these skills. But we can't do that until we can talk about it. And as long as my congresswoman friend is correct, that we in this country can't stand up on a political platform and say what I just said tonight, we're going to have a hard time accomplishing this. So my plea in this book and in my other writings is for us to think much more clearly about what power is, how it varies with context, and how you can combine hard and soft power skills in contextual intelligence into smart power. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe.
I like the argument very much. I've had an opportunity to argue this over too many iterations with Joe on fishing trips or otherwise, but let me try to do a little bit more challenging question or comment to try to emphasize something that I don't think came out in the conversation. The question is, how much is our judgment about an individual leader or about the relevant leadership skills colored by our view of the results of his or her major decisions? So let's talk about presidential leadership, and let's talk about Bush and Iraq. Now, the cliche says history is written by the victors. So let's imagine 10 years from now, so it's 2018, and Bush handed over Iraq to his successor, whoever it was, in this hypothetical history, and the level of violence declined at about the rate that it has in the last half of the surge. So now it's down to half of what it is today, let's say. And Iraq remains a dysfunctional state with 50,000 peacekeepers keeping the lid on things. But it looks sort of like Bosnia-Herzegovina now, 10 years after Clinton's intervention. So now there's a forum event, so it's 2018. And I imagine there'll be somebody here saying, comparing Bush to Truman. So the question is...
That's what Bush would like to imagine.
Yeah, and Bush certainly is thinking that, yeah. So, but I'm saying if we knew the results, before knowing the results, how could you distinguish between courage and stick-to-itiveness on the one hand, or stubborn obstinacy in the face of facts on the other? So is it all, or not all, but so substantially impacted by the results that then it's not fair to, or not?
Well, it's a great question. Bush does like to compare himself to Truman and say that history will absolve him. And David McCullough, Truman's biographer, has said it takes 50 years to be able to judge a presidency, and that's about where we are with Truman now. But one thing you can say about the Bush-Truman comparison is that by this stage in his presidency, Truman had at least two major foreign policy accomplishments, the Marshall Plan and NATO. Bush has none. So even at this stage, Truman looks a lot better. I wrote a piece in the Los Angeles Times a week ago saying that the comparison shouldn't be Bush and Truman, it should be Bush and Woodrow Wilson. Both very religious men with very grand visions, both extremely stubborn. And it's interesting, Wilson's stubbornness prevented the Senate ratifying the Treaty of the League of Nations. If he had not been stubborn, the treaty would have been ratified. But Wilson was totally unwilling to compromise on this, and for 20 years afterwards, we wound up with a reaction that led to isolationism, which was very costly. Wilson was rescued by World War II, where people turned to a variant of his vision. So you could say, suppose that Bush, 20, 40 years from now, suppose the Middle East looks pretty good. And you say, here's a democratic, stable Middle East, and maybe Bush messed it up for a few years, but shouldn't he get credit the way Wilson did in the 20-year long run? And I think there are two differences that historians will look at least that I argued in this piece. One is the recklessness with which Bush did his assessment. Wilson wasn't reckless in going into World War I. He agonized on it, thought about it deeply. The second was the unilateralism. Wilson joined allies in World War I. Bush essentially went on his own. So I think the process of the decision, historians will have to sort out to what extent this hypothesized stable Middle East 20 years from now is because of or in spite of Bush. But even so, the costs that Bush imposed by recklessness and unilateralism, I think will make historians more skeptical of him than they will be of Wilson, who had the same religious stubbornness about his decision.
Can I disagree for a second? I think, yes and no, I would say, because you're conflating too many things with Woodrow Wilson. In Woodrow Wilson's case, if you look at the thing for which he gets the most blame, it's the League of Nations, which didn't happen, first a set of illusions that were attached to it, and the unilateralism at the Versailles Treaty negotiations sounds extremely like the current characterization of Bush. Extremely. In fact, when the European leaders came back, they said, this person can't listen at all. He just has his view. And secondly, the result of this, one way or the other, was in any case Hitler coming to power and you get into World War II. So as the historians tell the story about Woodrow Wilson, it's mainly a story about somebody who's got a vision that's not realistic about some version of constraints or order in international politics. Now, in the Bush story, I'm just hypothesizing because I'm more interested in the conceptual question than in the actual judgment. In the Bush story, I'm not even imagining you get a stable democratic Middle East. I think that forget about it. Okay, I'm saying simply Iraq looks like Bosnia-Herzegovina. So not a very successful state, requires, quote, babysitters for a long period of time. But in any case, the conflict is now at a reasonably low level. And the alternative would have been to withdraw, or rapidly. So I think if Iraq goes to a catastrophic outcome, or to an intensified civil war, it'll be pretty easy to say all these Bush traits led to this terrible result. But if it happens not to end up in a terrible result, will that, certainly there are enough contrarian historians that somebody will write that. Okay, but the question is, how are you judging it? If I don't know the outcome, can I tell which of these stories, can I distinguish between stubborn determination on the one hand, and courageous stick-to-itiveness on the other?
Yeah. Well, the saying, there's a Harvard man on the wrong side of every issue. And so there's bound to be some future Harvard historian who will take that view. But I think you can make a case that Bush had more alternatives. One alternative he had was to contain Saddam Hussein, as our colleague Steve Walt has said. Another alternative was to not go in until he had a broad coalition with legitimacy, of soft power of legitimacy, as his father did in 1991. So he wasn't stuck with just either or. And I think historians will fault him for that. As to whether, when he made the mess he's made, having ignored these other alternatives, we should bail him out because he gets a Bosnia-Herzegovina, which might have occurred when the Civil War flames out. I don't know. I mean, that's probably where your historians will quibble.
Mm-hmm. Barbara?
Well, Graham has the good fortune of being your fishing buddy. I don't think we've ever gone fishing together,
No,
Joe.
but we're lunching buddies.
So I've got a series of questions. In fact, you better have a pencil and paper.
Okay.
I want to raise a couple of things with you, Joe, and you can interrupt me and respond, or you can just wait until I'm finished. It'll be very brief. First, I want to say something publicly that I've said to Joe, and it echoes something that David said. It's very rare for anyone to coin a phrase that becomes part of the English language. And the fact that Joe has found a way of getting people to talk about usually national power, soft and hard, that people have just adopted all the time is a very big deal. It's a certain kind of genius. So if only that, Joe, you're a genius. Okay, on to my questions. They're not really challenging you, except at the very end I'll raise a challenge. But they're to make some comments on what you've done that grow out of what I've done in recent years. The first one is to ask you, you've adopted the phrase contextual intelligence. To me, that gives somewhat short shrift to what I would call cognitive intelligence. And I'm thinking of one thing in particular. If you look at the world as it's unraveled over the last couple of decades, In '89, you had the collapse of communism, which changed the world as we knew it during the entire post-war period. I think we were just coming, and I don't mean particularly the United States, I think the world was just coming to understand the New World Order when 9/11 happened. And as far as I can tell, we have not had, since those two watershed events, an overarching way of seeing the world that would give policymakers, decision makers, citizens ways of framing the issues that seem to make sense. So I wondered if you would respond to that notion of an intellectual framework, or if you will, cognitive intelligence. Third, I have just myself written a very short piece called Tech Time: The Infinite Impact of Technology on Relations Between Leaders and Followers. A couple of my students are sitting here. They're not going to be surprised to hear me say that so far as I am now able to determine, technology is not upending, that's too strong a word, but is really changing relations between leaders and led in ways that we are just beginning to understand. I think it's the biggest thing to have happened since the American and French revolutions in terms of changing that power dynamic between people in positions of power, authority, and influence and those without. And I'd be curious to hear your reaction to that. Connected to this.
Do you want to just give us your conclusion about how it's changed?
Oh, I think it's,
Your summary
let me
conclusion?
go to my next point, David, and then I think it'll become clear. And you won't be surprised to hear it. Power is trickling, power and influence are trickling in very good part because of technology from those at the top toward those in the middle and those at the bottom. I'm big on follower power now. It happens that we're meeting tonight on a day when in France, and you may think this is trivial, I of course do not. As you know, most of you sitting in this room, there's this Olympic torch that's supposed to go through these various countries, and there were all kinds of plans. In fact, the French police were geared for this, and they were wearing roller skates, they were dressed as joggers, they knew this was coming, but still they could not control the chaos, just as the Chinese nor the Americans, Sarkozy is another matter, can control the agenda. In other words, the agenda is being hijacked at a range of turns by those who are in positions that we generally associate as being powerless. YouTube, MyFace, Facebook, the candidacy of Barack Obama, which a year ago Hillary Clinton was, quote, inevitable. That's a bottom-up candidacy. So a range of issues I just wish you would comment on. By the way, my favorite, or one of my favorite cases in point here, Joe, it's a country with which you're deeply familiar, is Pakistan. American leaders were not paying attention to the fact that the people of Pakistan, Musharraf notwithstanding, a year ago when the Chief Justice was dismissed by Musharraf, the lawyers took to the streets. Then other people, particularly members of the middle class, took to the streets. In other words, if we simply look leader to leader, as opposed to a different kind of intelligence, which I actually will give another name other than contextual intelligence, we're 20th century, and we're all those other centuries. We're not 21st century. Finally, I think I'll stop by challenging you on the notion of insular leadership, mainly because you do so in your book, you challenge me. In a book I wrote called Bad Leadership, and this will have a larger issue, I use Clinton as a case in point for insular leadership because the United States under him did nothing or very little with regard to Rwanda. I do make the point, Joe, in the book, that other leaders could similarly be used as examples. That is, Boutros Boutros-Ghali, who was at the time the Secretary General of the United States, so forth and so on. But my real question to you, since you yourself end your book with this, is to go back to the leadership theme and away from followers, although I think followers are pushing leaders in this direction. What is the responsibility when there's something hideous happening in the world, ethnic cleansing, genocide? What is the responsibility of a national leader when the phrase, gee, I didn't know, apropos technology, simply no longer applies?
Well, you sure you don't have 3 or 4 more?
I do, as
Good.
you know, David.
There you go.
Good set of questions, Barbara. Let me start with your middle.
Yes, yes, no, and
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
That may work on a fishing trip, but not in the forum at the Kennedy School.
Let me start with your point about technology and follower power, which I fully agree with, and I must put in a plug for Barbara's recent book on followership, which is terrific, and I've learned a lot from it. But it is fascinating to see the way information technology has empowered people who previously were disempowered. And I've always been struck by the fact that resources and capabilities that were once restricted to large bureaucracies and governments and corporations are now available to just about anybody. I mean, the internet is a perfect example of this. And that does mean that followers have a much broader capacity than they did. There's always been, as you point out in your book, followers always have some degree of power. And then the question is, how is that changing over time? And I think you're absolutely right that technology is greatly increasing the power of followers. But that reinforces my point that unless we start thinking about soft power more, we're not going to attract followers. It's not a situation where you can order people with commands as we once did. The effect of technology of flattening hierarchies into networks means we absolutely have to use more soft power. And that essentially is a point that I think you and I agree with. On the question of insularity, which is a hard one, insularity is, I mean, the key question is, when does a leader who has a group of followers that are to whom she or he is responsible, to what extent does that leader take into account the interests of those outside the group? You might say the group is the one who put them there, and if it's an elected democracy, the group are the ones who vote them in or out. But to what extent are you responsible for those outside? And I would argue that ethically, a leader should take into account the interests of those who are outside the group. So I don't think we disagree much on that. But I think that the question of how cosmopolitan can a leader in a democracy be is still a very difficult question. The leader who says, let's give all we have to those overseas, or let's go into Somalia and straighten it out at the cost of a large number of lives, is probably going to be voted out of office at home. And then the question is, where do you make the compromises? Anthony Appiah, who used a nice phrase in which he said, there are moral obligations in the 10 Commandments, some of which are absolute and others which are matters of degree. He said, thou shalt not kill is not pass-fail. I mean, you know, that's pretty absolute. But if you think about honor thy father and mother, it's a matter of degree. And I think politicians at this time in democracies are trapped into a situation in which the degree of cosmopolitanism they can embrace is limited by their followers. What can they do? They can try to educate their followers. They can work at the margins to go further and stretch things. And they can occasionally, like Jean Monnet in Europe after a crisis of World War II, engineer institutions which broaden people's horizons so that they see a much wider definition of what followers, who their group is and who their followers are. But it's one of the tough questions, and it's not going to be solved by even at a Kennedy School forum. On the question of your first question about a contextual picture of the world, I think the problem with the Americans is that we don't listen enough to the rest of the world. And in 1990, we had a view that we were finished. Our power was declining. This was the prevalent view. Paul Tsongas ran for president in 92 and said, the Cold War is over and Japan has won. Well, that was wrong. By 2001, we'd flipped totally the other direction. You got somebody like Charles Krauthammer writing that it's a unipolar world, only the Americans matter, and he calls for a new unilateralism in which he says explicitly, the United States is so strong that we can do whatever we want and others have no choice but to follow. That's a direct quote from his writing. That is nutty. I mean, to go from underestimating our role in the world and misunderstanding the context to overestimating our role in the world is, this pendulum doesn't have to swing that far. And if I've argued that the way to think of this is to see different contexts of power internationally. Military power, we are a superpower. Economic power, we are, in fact, in a multipolar world. And on transnational issues, on this three-dimensional chessboard I'm sketching out for you, things that cross borders outside of governments, like pandemics or climate change or transnational terrorism, nobody's in charge. And the only way you can deal with that bottom level, from which so many of the biggest threats come from, is with soft power. So I've been trying to argue that if we get away from this view that one level does it all, and the Americans are a little bit like one of Molly's and my grandsons with a hammer who thinks every problem's a nail. You know, we have this military instrument, we think that'll solve everything. And what we don't realize is if you play on one board only in a three-dimensional game, in the long run, you're going to lose. And we've got to learn to think of context being different, and that our power is effective in some more than others, but that it doesn't necessarily transfer one to another. And contextual intelligence knows how to combine hard and soft into a smart strategy.
Let me, if I might, come back to where this conversation started. You said that you know, history is often determined by the winners. I'm reminded what Churchill said, that he expected to be well remembered by history because he intended to write it.
And did.
And did. And,
Wonderfully.
but I wanted to come back to this issue that's playing out now in the campaign, in the context both of George W. Bush and of the current candidates. And that is the question of judgment, and the judgment that goes into decision-making. Graham, you've written about this. Barbara, you've written about this as well. It's been commonly assumed that judgment comes from experience and a lot of failures, and eventually refining your judgment and making it better. And it's being argued in this campaign, no, really, judgment can be independent of experience, and judgment actually trumps experience. How should we think about that as we assess the presidential candidates?
Well, Warren Bennis has written a book on judgment, which is
Right.
very intelligent. I think judgment comes from a combination of experience and what I call emotional IQ. It's not just experience, because you can think of lots of people with experience who still don't develop very good judgment. They develop a standard operating procedure, a way to respond to certain things. They're very good when the bandwidth is for that type of crisis. But if it's a broader set of instances or problems, they're not necessarily good at tuning to a different bandwidth. And I think that it requires not just experience, in the sense I've been through this several times. It also requires an intuitive sense that grows out of your emotional IQ, your sense of inner security, your ability to outreach to others, to listen to others, rather than decide that you know the answer and are doing it yourself. So I think it's a combination. I don't think experience is enough to make judgment.
Where does curiosity fit into this? I've had the sense that that there's one thing to have a decision-making by hunch, uninformed hunch, as we've seen in the last few years, when it seems to be uninformed. It's another thing to have your instincts trained by a lot of curiosity applied to your experiences.
I think curiosity is extremely important. I mean, many people fault George W. Bush for not being intelligent. I think that's absolutely wrong. I think he's highly intelligent. I don't think he's intellectually curious. I don't think that he reaches out and seeks for information. It's interesting. I mean, if you look at, you know Franklin Roosevelt better than I do, David, but if you look at Roosevelt, he talked to everybody. He was always looking for a new piece of information from anybody, and surrounded himself with irregular procedures so that he would get information from all sources. George W. Bush, in contrast, doesn't really seek out information that way. The intriguing thing is that when Jay Garner was fired as the first ruler of Iraq after the invasion, he came in for his exit interview with George W. Bush in the Oval Office, and if Woodward is correct, they talked football. The idea that a president would take somebody he'd fired from a position as dangerous and difficult as Iraq and waste the time talking football instead of saying, well, what was it like there? He might disagree with everything that Garner said, but he didn't ask. Something wrong with that.
Yeah, interesting. Graham?
Maybe I'm stuck on the earlier one, because I think, again, if you try to ask about people's judgment, mainly I look at the results. And if I see the results, and I see a pattern of results, then I have more confidence in the fact that they have judgment. I know that, but the question is in advance.
Well, how do you judge a person like Barack Obama as a candidate in terms of his judgment?
Well, I think you have very little information on the basis of which to make the judgment, to make an assessment, because you can look at a history, which is a remarkable biography. You can look at his performance as a student. You can look at his performance as a state legislator. You can look at his performance in the Senate. Not a whole lot to go on. And I think in situations in which you'd feel more comfortable if you had seen him take decisions and organize actions. Now, I'd say with respect to the campaign, there you get a lot of information about how somebody thinks about constructing a campaign and building a campaign. Probably more information there than in the rest of the behavior.
Interesting. Barbara, let me, if I might, just switch subject, then let's go to the floor. You talk in a very interesting ways about how the internet is changing the relationship between leader-followers and followers and the French experience. Does that not also suggest that there may be a new form of leadership that is emerging, that leader as catalyst, not leader as someone who orders, or not even leader as someone who empowers others in the organization, but leader as catalyst who, in effect, sparks action by people who don't work for her or for him? I think of Jimmy Wales and hearing him in a panel with Wikipedia. He founded Wikipedia. And now, it's a powerful force on the internet, and you'd have to say he's been a real leader to start this off. He has a staff of 12 people, just 12 people. And what's happening is thousands upon thousands of people have signed up and have become actively involved because they're in effect inspired by his ideas, his vision. Muhammad Yunus has a very small team, but his idea, generated lots and lots of people to become involved in microfinancing. Or the Barack Obama campaign. I mean, the mybarackobama.com has gotten a couple of million people apparently who are sort of self-engaged.
1.5 million people have visited the site.
And they're out there self-organizing.
And it's self-organizing, and as everybody in this room almost certainly knows, in a month like January, 90% of the contributions, which were almost $32 million, were from people giving under $100 through the internet. Right. Barack Obama is the only one of the candidates who has the slightest idea of what the new technology is about.
Yeah, he brought somebody in from Yahoo, I think.
And he has done, but he knew enough apropos judgment. This is not a promo for Obama at all, but if you're going to talk 21st century trends, right. Hillary Clinton has been notoriously maladroit at using the web. And McCain, I think, hasn't used it very much. Barack Obama's candidacy is, I'm glad you mentioned that site. It's a real case in point. Just very quickly to respond to your question, David, because I know we want to go to the floor, about catalysts. It's one of the points I make. Who ever heard of Jimmy Wales? And is Jimmy Wales a leader in any other area? No, just this, but the just this is huge. And what people increasingly are doing is not necessarily upending their leaders, but simply circumventing them. They don't get what they want. I want to do animal rights. I care about the environment. My leaders aren't doing it. Okay, I'm going to do it myself.
Right. But what I'm saying is you can do it, if you figure out the trick to do it in a positive way, you can get lots and lots of people to do something that they don't work for you, they're not on your payroll, you don't take orders from you.
Absolutely.
They just feel, I'm going to go out and do this.
Other activists, other participants, people who want to get involved and are not finding conventional, traditional establishment ways of doing so.
Yeah, it's interesting. Jimmy Wales is now taking time out to think about, can I take the principles of Wikipedia and apply them to climate change? Can I get people engaged on climate change in the same way? It's a very interesting leadership question. Okay, floor is open. Love to have your thoughts, questions. We can happily continue here. Yes, sir. If you would, the famous Joe Nye rule, one question per customer, and all questions end with a question mark. Yes, sir.
My name is Michael Brower. I'm a graduate of this school about 1,000 years ago. My question is really for Barbara, but then I'd like to hear Joe and Graham reflect on it. This last discourse about the power of technology means to me that to say leader and follower is outdated language. Leadership, yes, but what do we call all these people who aren't just followers, who are themselves leading certain aspects of Barack's campaign or of Wikipedia or anything else? I was sitting here thinking, I agree with everything you said, but then I think, leader, follower? Give me some better language.
I think it's a great point. I think the idea of leaders and followers is becoming increasingly fungible. I did it. I'm a leadership expert also from 1,000 years ago. And I found that my own field was getting so damn leader-centric that it was rather oblivious to everybody else. And everybody was nervous, always nervous about the word follower. God forbid we be seen as a sheep. Call them constituents, call them activists, call them participants, call them what you will. It doesn't make any difference. The point is that power is increasingly devolving to the people, particularly when they are dissatisfied with those who traditionally we think of as leaders. But I agree with you about the terminology.
Call them devolvees.
There's that.
Okay.
The question, the word follower is not a great term.
I beg your pardon.
I'm sorry, Barbara, but it's too late. It's too late to retitle the book. But you know, there are other words you use. Ron Heifetz uses the term constituents or something. The important thing to understand is that everybody, except perhaps for one or two people, a monarch or a president, is both a leader and a follower. And most people, in fact, lead from the middle. The idea that there's a leader, which is this great man descended from heaven who gives orders to everybody else, that makes no sense at all. Almost everybody is leading in the middle. There are some people above you who you have to attract to what you want to do. There's some people below you who you have, in hierarchical terms, who you want to attract to do what you want. And there's some people on both sides of you over whom you have no direct authority that you need to attract. So if you think in soft power terms, you really think of leading from all 4 points of a compass, north, south, east, and west. And that's, I think, a better than the image of the leader who rushes ahead and the followers. You know, they're all the way back to the French Revolution, where Mirabeau is famously quoted as saying, "Where's that crowd going? I'm its leader."
We would again ask you to identify yourselves. We're going to turn to the economist.
Matthew Bishop. I suppose I'm intrigued as to how much of this is really new in terms of the transparency and the mass mobilization through the internet and so forth. Because it seems to me you go back to Churchill giving moving speeches over the radio during the Second World War and really engaging directly with the public then. And then you look at, I guess, my question really would be, how is Obama, let's assume he becomes president.
How is what?
Let's assume Obama becomes president. How does he use all this new technology to communicate with the public if he decides to stay in Iraq, which he may well have to do come next year? Will he actually find he can communicate and explain this difficult decision that he's had to make? Or will he simply find everyone moves to a different Facebook, Obama sucks or something like that? Is that going to be the new protest, which will be about as effective as traditional protests have been? So I really think, in a sense, we all get excited about every new form that comes along, but actually the same challenges remain. He's going to have to, as a president, take difficult decisions if he gets that job, and communicating that and bringing the public along is still going to be extremely difficult. So how much of this is really new?
Well, I think if you look at what's new, the ability to broadcast from one to many is not at all new. I mean, the Churchill speeches, Roosevelt's fireside chats, and so forth. And the ability to go from many to one is what voting is about in a democracy. What's really new is peer-to-peer, from the many to the many. And we're just at the beginnings of understanding that. And we've seen it being used now in campaigning, as Barbara mentioned. The question is whether, to what extent, it'll be used in governing. So all the talk about e-government is not really dealing with this. The question is, will a person who's president, whether if Obama is president, will he be able to use these peer-to-peer techniques to gain ways to advance an agenda? And that we haven't.
Peer-to-peer and what Obama is doing. I mean, you're getting a whole load of people produce a Yes We Can video for YouTube, and you're getting a lot of people sign up at a very superficial level through Facebook. But I mean, where's the peer-to-peer policy making or anything of that kind? I mean, it's really not happening, and there's no real engagement with difficult political questions through any of this, as far as I can see.
Well, the question is whether peer-to-peer will generate support for political action. You think of a president who puts legislation before the Congress, and he lobbies, he promises a dam here in this state, a road there in that state, and so forth. If at the same time you find that the peer-to-peer networks are putting pressure on Congress people to actually vote for this, that might be something new. I mean, that's the dimension which I think we're just beginning to enter.
Yeah, can I just please, go ahead,
one
Barbara,
thing?
please.
Did I hear you correctly say the new site is going to be Obama Sucks? Did I hear that? I just want to make sure I heard that correctly. I want to agree with your point. Well, not with your overarching point, because I do think there's something new. But if you're implying that what is a positive can instantaneously be turned into a negative, I would absolutely agree with that. And I think the technology, one of the things it's doing is making leadership even more difficult than it has been heretofore, precisely because information is widely dispersed. Second of all, peer-to-peer contact. And third of all, the many have ways of making themselves heard in a way they've not had heretofore.
Let me just echo one thing Barbara said. One of the great strengths that leaders have had in the past is information has been power. And they've hoarded that information and then just given out what they had to, and they've been stripped of that power. I think Barbara correctly pointing out. It is also true, though, that on the other side of this, there is great leverage that Barack Obama has found, that very few political figures have found, in being able to communicate in this fashion. We haven't had, since Roosevelt, an American president from the Democratic Party who has been able to mobilize people outside Washington very effectively, who has been good at playing the outside game, not just the inside game of inside Washington politics, but the outside game where you mobilize people, thousands, or if not millions, who may write letters, cards, and put pressure on their representatives to do things, and indeed may be able to mobilize people around the world in various ways that we haven't seen before. And that's an unusual form of power, and it's extremely important in being able to put pressure on a political system to have that kind of people power out there as a potential for you. It could go the other way. People could float away and everything else. But Johnson didn't do this. He was very much an inside guy. Carter could never do this. Clinton really couldn't do it very well, and that's why his health care plan went down, because the right has been very good at this. Reagan was very good at this. The right has figured this out a long time ago, how to have grassroots support and build that up and put pressure on. The left has had a very, very hard time doing that since Roosevelt, and I think Barack Obama holds the promise or the potential of being the first person in a long, long time from the left who would have that possibility, and that would, frankly, enhance his power a great deal. Let me go up here. Well, we can come this way. It's fine. I think the waving hand gets the question. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. I just want to go back to the beginning when Joseph Nye was talking about our obsession with this macho concept of power. And I wrote down that you said soft power doesn't sell. Particularly, I can imagine on the stump. and that we don't do this very well here in the US. How can we learn how to do this? How can, in so many words, this nuanced concept be communicated to people? And do you think that Barack Obama is in some way representing this talent?
Well, it's an interesting point. I think historically, there have been times when we've understood it. Dwight Eisenhower used to say that he would rather have another exchange program with the Soviet Union than another bomber. So Eisenhower, the general, understood it. Many of the American military actually understand it more than the civilians. After 9/11, we got even worse at this, partly because of the people who were in top positions and partly because of broad fear. But it's intriguing if in 2002, Don Rumsfeld said he didn't understand soft power, which was a problem.
And he proved it.
And he proved it. Last November, Robert Gates, the defense secretary, gave a speech in which he said, we have to do more investing in our soft power. He said, there's something wrong with a country that spends $500 billion on the Defense Department and $37 billion on our soft power. And he said, we've got to get over this. So, and we had this Smart Power Commission that in Washington, which was half Republican, half Democrat, which essentially...
you co-chaired.
Which I co-chaired with Richard Armitage, where you got Republicans and Democrats talking about the need to combine hard and soft power. So we're beginning to get a dialogue along these lines, but I would argue that it's been very slow. The interesting thing to me about Obama is I think he probably gets it more than other candidates. I think Hillary Clinton has a certain disadvantage that because of gender stereotypes, she has to play against those and act harder. And Obama doesn't have that limit. So I think it's a little bit harder for Hillary, but I think Obama has indicated an ability to understand soft power. Indeed, he embodies it.
Just a small footnote. I don't know why I'm the Republican representative here tonight, since I would never be nominated for that position and wouldn't do a very good job of it. But for a local advertisement here, if you want to go see in the Forum archives, which you can go to by just going to the Kennedy School website, you can see the last McCain Forum here, which was back in 2005, I think, but I'm not sure of the dates. And I must say, I never saw an event here in the Forum in which more students, more undergraduates, were attracted to the idea of public service and this person's biography of public service as that event. So you can just go look at it, look it up.
I agree with that. Please.
Thank you. My name is David from Meijs. I'm MPP 07 and a research fellow here at the center. Am I audible? Yeah. My question relates, is for Professor Nine, but I'm also interested to hear from Professors Allison and Kellerman. And it relates to your previous book, because I haven't had a chance to read your new book. And for a brief moment, I want to take you to my interview for Fulbright about 3 years ago, where, because I had mentioned your book in my application essay, and one of the interviewers referred to your book, and in a very cryptical way tried to tell me more something than actually ask me, and it's the following. It is, he said, he was trying to say that it is good, it's one step to go from hard power to soft power, but the assumption, which I take also from your book, is still that you're trying to influence and change the other party. And you also started your talk today by saying, if you want to influence. And so this relates more to international relations from one country to another. And luckily I understood what he was cryptically trying to say, otherwise I wouldn't be here right now. But could you speak to that question? Because there is I would say a normative assumption underlying, if you want to influence, that it is fine to influence in this regard, in your previous book, other countries.
Yeah, let me make clear that soft power is not good per se. It's not a normative concept, it's a descriptive concept. I think it was Graham who once said to me, it's not better to twist minds than to twist arms. There is something, I mean, if if you judge power, whether it's good or bad, you judge it by the purposes to which it's put. Osama bin Laden had soft power. He did not point a gun at the head of the people who flew the planes. They did it because they were attracted to his vision, sadly. But so soft power is not good or bad per se. And you judge power, whether it's good or bad, by the purposes to which it's put. So what I'm saying is if you want to influence others, if you want to affect them to get the outcomes you want, it's just a question of how do you combine hard and soft power skills in different contexts to do that. Whether that's good or bad is the subject of the 5th chapter of my book, but it's all about purpose, not about the nature of soft power per se.
A couple more and we'll stop. Yes, sir.
Eric Iverson, and I'm a student at the Fletcher School. And my question is actually for the entire panel, and it speaks to, a bit to the answer you just gave, and that is, how do you see violent extremists, be they terrorists or insurgents, embracing this new model of leadership that you've all described to varying degrees? And to the extent that they are, how can these tactics be countered?
I think it's a very good question, and I think if you take the period since 9/11 and ask who's done a better job of communicating a narrative and connecting it to events and persuading quite a lot of people that this narrative is not just coherent, but actually is the main storyline, I would say Osama and Al-Qaeda have actually done a better job, than we have. Now, what would be some evidence of that? I think if we take the international polls, the Pew international polls, or if we look at this recent British poll that was in The Economist last week, if you ask most people in most countries, which country is the greatest threat to international peace and security? They say the United States. Excuse me, okay? You look at that and you say, this can't conceivably be. The answer is they've asked this question over and over, and they do. Now, who told them that? Whose narrative has that been? Osama's, okay? What else did he say? He said, let me tell you, this is right after 9/11, what the Americans are going to do is invade an Arab country, and they're going to occupy it because they want to seize its oil. Quite a lot of people think this looks somewhat like a story they've seen. We could go on and on and on. But I would say the proposition that they have had some, and actually to be doing this while you're on the run from cave to cave in ungoverned territory in Afghanistan, it's a pretty impressive undertaking. If you look at his tapes or at the videotapes that he and Zawahiri do. So I'd say it'd be a very nice study for somebody looking at the subject to take the communication strategy of the US government on the one hand, which has a few more resources and a lot more time, and the communication strategy of a few guys that are running around, without that much technological access, and say how they've done. And I would say they've done, unfortunately, extremely well.
We've had two people who've been waiting patiently, so we'll take both questions. Why don't we ask each of you to give a question, and then we'll go to summary answers here on the panel, if we might.
Okay, I'm Alberto Volmer from Venezuela. I've been here for about a week at the Kennedy School, and it's been an incredible relief not to have heard about the name Hugo Chavez for a week. But my question is, we've talked about soft power, hard power, smart power, and I'd like to know how we deal with lousy power.
Lousy power? All right, that's a question, please, sir.
Hi, my name is Andrew Leifer. I'm a PhD candidate in GSAS, and I heard one of you say that information is power, and information has been more democratized with new technology. And I guess I'm not convinced. Can you give a more convincing argument? Because I look at the type of power that's most often abused seems to have to do, from governments, has to do with foreign policy issues, for example, and on things most recent, and there's a history of that. You look at the war that was started with Spain through the media, or anyway. But you look at climate change, you look at the situation in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it seems like there's still a very tight grip monopoly on information there. So is anything new?
Well, okay. Lousy power and in this information question, who would like to take a crack at either one?
I'll do lousy power.
All right.
Which doesn't mean my colleagues can't also do lousy power. I think once power is already lousy, wherever you are, I don't know, there you are. Once power is already lousy, it's actually very difficult to upend it. I have studied bad leadership or lousy power. It's a good title for a book. I'll use it the next time. At some length, and it's one of the reasons I've become interested in followers, trying to figure out what people can do when, in fact, lousy power is entrenched. Without going on a great length, it's my conclusion that the longer you wait to upend it, the more difficult it is to uproot. Very rarely does lousy power begin as lousy power. Even most of history's worst tyrants, and I can say this in terms of global politics or in the workplace for that matter, they don't usually start that way. And so one of the responsibilities that is ours is to pay greater attention and to have a better cognitive understanding of the things that we can do. I don't mean to oversimplify it because it's tough, but it's not impossible. And the longer or the more we're willing to tolerate lousy power, we're going to keep getting it over and over again. We get to some degree, in truth, the leadership we deserve.
Oh, that's interesting. Joe, you're going to lousy power as a derivative of all these other kind of powers you've introduced?
Well, no, it's an interesting twist. I mean, it's obviously a evaluative term. Soft power, as I said, is a descriptive term. But yeah, there are, it's bad power, lousy power. I think the intriguing case we're seeing right now, and it relates to the second question, is what's happening with Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. Here you have somebody, if you believe the descriptions, who, as Barbara said, didn't start out that badly, but who's gotten worse and worse. And, you know, this goes back to Lord Acton's power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But the intriguing question to me is to what extent information is being, whether he can still tightly hold that information, or whether the broadening of information is making it harder for him. And this is a drama that we're seeing played out right now, and it's not clear how it's going to turn out. I mean, there are societies, Myanmar is one, North Korea is another, where information is tightly controlled, and it's not easy to get Kim Jong-il overthrown because the information system is a 1950s model of information control from the top. But look at the costs of running a society where the information can be controlled that tightly. Both Myanmar and North Korea have paid a huge price for it. I guess my feeling is that when you're dealing with lousy power, whether it's those two cases, or whether it's Zimbabwe, or whether it's Chavez, my inclination on how to deal with this is more contact rather than less. That the hardest problem that people who are dictators or lousy power wielders have is isolating their people so they can control them. And we tend to react with sanctions, cut people off, less contact the better. I think that's exactly the wrong way. In fact, sometimes targeted sanctions against particular individuals or groups may be useful, but this general cut them off, what greater favor could you do to a two-bit dictator than to help him isolate his people? And what does American policy generally do? It falls right into that sanctions trap, because it's good politics at home. But I think, for example, on the particular point of Chavez, I think that the less we pay attention to him, the more we let him dig his own hole, the better. the more we anathematize him and the more it becomes a hero, he becomes a hero in others' eyes in Latin America, the more we're helping him out.
Yeah, I want to come back to this notion about information. I'm a little startled by your assertion, but let me just suggest to you, the Holocaust could not happen in today's environment. You couldn't keep something like that as secret as it remained from the world, much of the world, as long as it remained secret in Germany and in Poland and places like that. There may be small places like Abu Ghraib where there is torture, but they are found out now in this new age. There are people who can get pictures out, and it horrifies the world. That has really, that kind of democratization, there are so many different places in the world now where you can put a camera in that you didn't do that before, and so many dictators have been upended because of that. And on climate change, wow, you got the whole scientific community that has access and is publicizing information that when the EPA tries to change something or rewrite something in the government, it's immediately, people immediately throw rocks at it because it doesn't last. Those secrets don't hold.
David,
yeah.
I see the
I know he's got
the
a
young man-
response.
I see the young man going, but what about Rwanda? I think I agree with almost everything you said. The other question, though, is when we do know, and this goes back to the brief exchange that Joe and I had, what do we do about it? We did know fully about, you're right, we knew about, the Holocaust can't happen again quite in that way. So we know about it, as we know about Darfur, and we hear noises of various kinds, and yet not a whole hell of a lot happens, which goes back to the question of what constitutes appropriate national leadership, and to use your phrase, or word, Joe, cosmopolitan leadership. You and I continue, by the way, to have a small difference on that. I think in this day and age, greater creativity and inventiveness about what constitutes national versus cosmopolitan leadership, with leaders using the bully pulpit to push toward cosmopolitan and away from national or group or tribe, is, again, I think it's the wave of the 21st century.
But again, maybe in the contrarian role, I would say you don't need to look back at the Holocaust. You don't need to look back at Rwanda. You can look at Darfur now. You can look at Nick Kristof and Samantha on Darfur. The evidence is overwhelming that there's a large number, that is several 100,000 people have been killed. Is any leader in any country made this an issue about which they want to do anything? And I think the answer is no, and that's happening today. And is any one of the candidates proposing they're going to do something? I don't think so. And is Sarkozy doing something? I don't think so. And Mr. Brown? I don't think so. So there's a lot of noise about this. So I think it's close to the gentleman. There's a lot of noise and not very much action.
No, but the question is not whether, the question he was making, the point he was making was leaders still can control a lot of information. And I would say it's very difficult for leaders to control information today. It's a different issue from whether we then have the political will to respond. And I think on that issue, we haven't improved very much. But I think the governments today do not have anything like the kind of authority and control over information, inside information they once had. It's inconceivable. When Graham does a study of the Cuban Missile Crisis, part of the judgment that went in the Cuban Missile Crisis was they could control that for 13 days. They were in control of the information. It's very hard to imagine that holding today. Graham, do you think?
Absolutely, no. I think the information piece is huge, and I think the interesting question for further, exploration is how does this end up impacting the actions of government?
Right. But we're not going to try to shut you down. If you have one more point, the floor is yours. No, it wasn't about a new question. You at one point seemed poised to jump over the banister.
All right. No, that makes a lot of sense. I was thinking more in terms of misinformation regarding Iraq and what most people, the way that the bully pulpit influences people's just because information is out there doesn't mean that the public is paying any attention to it. And when the government says, there's a lot of uncertainty with climate change, people pay attention to that. And when the government says Al-Qaeda has something to do with Iraq, people believe it. And so just opening new channels of information doesn't necessarily change the dynamics.
I agree about the misinformation, but your misinformation gets exposed a lot faster. It took us a long time to understand the Gulf of Tonkin. And we understood WMD and things like that. Same watch, same leaders. It's not to say that leaders can't try to misinform. They do. But that there are many more checks in the system than there used to be.
One more just factum from the polls. What percentage of Americans know the deep, dark secret that evolution is the way in which human beings have evolved and believe this? What percentage? And the answer is a smaller percentage than believe in UFOs.
Right.
30%.
Right.
So this is for our international visitors.
It's only a theory, Graham.
Maybe if we kept declared evolution.
They call it Darwinian theory, don't they?
Well, it's clear if we declared evolution to be a government secret,
Maybe
we'd break the secret and everybody would know. Well, I think that you all who have we hardy few, we have all stuck this through because I think all of us understand just how important these conversations are. And Joe, we're deeply in your debt that you've written this book, and we commend it to all of you. But it once again proves that Joe Nye has a lot to teach us, and we're honored to be in your presence. Thank you.
Thank you.